Well, when we last left off with Edwards, he was just arriving at Yale. I think he was asking his parents for money, if I remember, and he was throwing himself into his studies. Edwards ended up receiving his bachelor's degree, and then he stayed on at Yale and earned his master's degree. Now, in those days, the colleges didn't think they were around quite long enough to have the clout to offer doctorates. So the master's degree was as far as they went. And likely the work that Edwards did was easily equivalent to doctoral work today. In fact, his master's thesis had to be written in Latin. It had to be original composition in Latin. This is a reproduction of the first page of Edwards' master's thesis, which he handwrote in Latin. And the thesis is right up front, that a sinner is not justified coram Deo, and I don't think I need to tell this audience what coram Deo means. It literally means, before the face of God, but here the idea is before God. A sinner is not justified before God apart from the righteousness of Christ apprehended by faith. So his master's thesis was a statement on justification by faith. Now, Edwards had to write the thesis in Latin. He had to read the thesis on graduation day in Latin. And at the conclusion of his thesis, the faculty would quiz him in front of the crowd gathered for the commencement, would quiz him in Latin. And Edwards had to answer back in Latin. In fact, at the end of this manuscript of his master's thesis, we see him writing out a number of little sentences in Latin. And what he wasn't doing was anticipating the questions he would get and was writing for himself a cheat sheet so he could have the first sentence all ready to go and he could let that faculty have it, that he knew his stuff, right? Today, when you graduate, all you have to do is walk across the platform without tripping, and that's pretty much all you need to do. But in those days, it was pretty intense. Well, before he wrote his master's thesis, Edwards actually took his first pastorate. He was 19, going on 20. And his first pastorate was a Presbyterian church in New York City. Edwards he was a Congregationalist most of his life. But his first ministry was as a Presbyterian minister, and his final ministry was at a Presbyterian institution, Princeton. So at least at the beginning and the end, Edwards got it right. But anyway, he went down to pastor this church. Now this church was a splinter off of the Presbyterian church that was at Broad and Wall Street. In fact, it's still there today. It's First Presbyterian Church of New York City. Edwards pastored a splinter group that met at the docks of the New York harbor. Now you've got to picture this for Edwards. Edwards was used to East Windsor, Connecticut. This was country. Now he is living in the big city, New York City. So what that means is, instead of just one horse going by in front of his house every day, now about 5 or 6 horses would go by in front of his house. But here he is in New York City, a rather strange environment, far from his home. I didn't mean to say it was a strange environment, a different environment, we'll put it that way, far from his home. And what he does is he starts writing out these resolutions that are going to govern his life. So he writes out his 70 or so resolutions. What's fascinating about these resolutions, and it seems like at the New Year's time, everybody wants to make resolutions and write resolutions, and they only last for a couple of weeks. What's interesting about these resolutions is the preface. And the preface is the key to the whole thing. The preface is acknowledging his limitation, acknowledging his sinfulness, and asking that God in his grace enable him to do these. So we have to remember that. And then he goes on and writes his resolutions. One of my favorite resolutions of his is that he says, resolved never to speak ill of anyone, except it be for a good cause. I love that. If he had only stopped at the never to speak ill, then we say, that guy, he's always showing us up. But when he goes on to say, except to be for a good cause, we understand that, yes, he is truly a human being, and we appreciate him. A number of his resolutions sort of go something like this. He says, frequently you hear that persons, when they are of older age, will sometimes speak of how they wish there were more things they had done, and that if they were only young again, they would live their life differently. So he says, resolved to live my life exactly how, if I find myself on my deathbed, I would have wanted my life to have been lived. This is an interesting insight that a young 19-year-old has. Most 19-year-olds, and I know I'm projecting on our own culture here, back onto Edwards, but most 19-year-olds aren't even sure what they're going to do in their 20th year, let alone trying to look down the corridor of their life and live their life in a way that is sold out to God, that is lived for him and is lived in the pursuit of his glory. That's what we see in these resolutions. As I mentioned earlier, Edwards is the kind of guy who thinks in pen and ink. If he's thinking it, he's likely writing it. And so we're going to see how writing becomes a constant companion in Edwards from the time of this New York pastorate. Well, other interesting insight we get into his life here is that after a few months of pastoring this church in New York City, he actually counsels them to reunite with the church they split off from. That's remarkable for two reasons. One is it shows his ability to deal with people as a 19-year-old. The second thing is it shows a bit of his altruism, because when they rejoin back with the church, that means he's out of a job. And so Edwards goes back home. He actually falls ill as he travels back home. And instead of returning to Yale, he convalesces at his parents' home. And it's while he's convalescing in his parents' home that he writes his master's thesis on justification by faith. Another piece of writing that comes from this Yale time is the first thing that Edwards intended for publication. It comes to be called the Spider Letter. It was written to the Judge Paul Dooley. It is a letter that was intended to be published in the Transactions of the Royal Scientific Society back in Old England. Jonathan's father, Timothy, actually had written up a piece about a pumpkin vine. And this was an amazing pumpkin vine. This single pumpkin vine ended up bringing in something like 16 wagon loads of pumpkins. Some of them, Timothy describes, were a yard in circumference. This was some pumpkin vine. Timothy wrote the whole thing up, sent it off to the Transactions of the Royal Society of Science, and it was published. And so Jonathan Edwards is going to try his hand at publishing on science, and so he wants to publish about the flying spider. And what Edwards did was he got a shutter, dark shutter, and he went out and he positioned himself. He really liked nature. He'd see this insect dropping, and he'd position the shutter behind the spider so he could see what was going on. See, this is just good old Newtonian observation, right? And what Edwards saw is that as the spider released itself on one web, it released another web. It was sort of a liquid, and it would solidify and would harden in the air and would actually take on weight and moisture from the air. And then the spider would release that first web it dropped down from, and then it would retract this new web, and it actually looked as if it were flying. And the wind would carry this, they could do this 20, 30 yards. The wind would carry this web to a tree, and the spider literally looked like it was flying. And Edwards explained how it was done. In the letter, he says it's a good thing that God made them this way, because up in New England, as the winter winds come, they blow out to the sea, and all these poor spiders get blown out to the ocean. But Edwards says, no, wait, that's a good thing, because otherwise we'd be overrun with spiders. But he also says this. He's speaking of the wisdom of God in providing this means to essentially exterminate all of these spiders. But then he says, In this, we also see, quote, the exuberant goodness of the Creator, who hath not only provided for all the necessities, but also for the pleasure and recreation of all sorts of creatures, even the insects. So what Edwards actually saw was that as these spiders fly, they were smiling. Maybe they were saying yippee as they flew across the sky, see? And here God provides not only for the necessities, but even for the pleasure of all of his creatures, even the insects. Right? This is a fascinating way to view the world. I just wish there was something contagious about Jonathan Edwards' vision, that we could capture this kind of a vision of seeing the world that we live in, that we're always tracing back what we see back to how we understand God and how God made us and why God made us and what God wants us to do on this earth. Edwards was so concerned about that theme that he even applied that to spiders. The letter apparently was never published. One of his early biographers, who also married one of his daughters, Timothy Dwight, made the case that Edwards wrote the letter when he was 12 years old. Turns out not to be quite true. He was 18 when he wrote the letter. The original was actually found just about 30 years ago in the basement of the New York Historical Society. And there the original was dated, and Edwards actually wrote it on October 31st. So he was thinking of Reformation Day, and he was thinking of spiders. So we have the spider letter, and we have the master's thesis. But what we see here, I think, is a very gifted individual. It looks like he might have been thinking about pursuing a career in science, as it was understood in the 1700s. It looked like he could have easily been pursuing a career as a theologian. He easily also could have stepped into the pastorate. But what we really see is when Edwards graduates with his master's degree, is very likely somebody who's not sure what he particularly wants to do with his life. And what ends up happening is he ends up staying at Yale. The rector of Yale, the president of Yale, was Samuel Johnson. There's the British Samuel Johnson who did the dictionary, and then there's America's own Samuel Johnson. And Samuel Johnson did the worst thing possible a Puritan could do. In fact, when this event made its way out, it was referred to as the Great Apostasy. Samuel Johnson became an Anglican. This is a terrible thing for a New England Congregationalist. Harvard had a field day over this. We may have latitudinarians, but we certainly don't have Anglicans. And so Samuel Johnson goes to New York, and he establishes a new college. He calls it the King's College. And today we know it as Columbia University. But in the absence of Samuel Johnson, Yale was teetering. In fact, it was on the verge of collapse and was all about to fall apart. This was I'm joking about it, but this was a real scandal that had happened to Yale. And Edwards stayed on there as tutor and basically for 2 years held Yale together. So we almost see him either by default or by choice, looks like he's pursuing a life of academics. But then comes 1727. Now, Edwards had been smitten by a young lady in New Haven. Her name was Sarah. She was the daughter of John Pierpont, who was indeed one of the founders of Yale. And Yale University has Pierpont College as one of its colleges, named for Sarah's father, who will be Jonathan Edwards' father-in-law. And one of their sons was named Pierpont Edwards to carry on that family name. But he meets Sarah Pierpont, and he goes back to his dorm room, and he pulls down one of his textbooks that he was lecturing to his students on, and he writes in the flyleaf an apostrophe to Sarah Pierpont. And he says, "They say there is a young lady in New Haven, so beloved of God and loving God and I'll paraphrase here, that she has this inner spiritual beauty. Well, we know what Edwards was really talking about, don't we? He's trying to frame it in spiritual terms, but he's talking about her physical beauty that had captured him. But here's the problem. He was an academic. That was not a respectable profession in the 1700s. He could barely support himself, let alone a wife, let alone the many children that would follow. So what was he to do? Right. Well, then in 1727, Edwards gets an invitation. Now, in those days, they viewed pastoral succession a little differently than we do. In those days, as the pastor was aging, maybe when he was about 5 to 7 years away from death, they would send off to one of the colleges for a pastor. And they would send the deacons. And the deacons would go to Harvard, or they would go to Yale, or later they would go to Princeton. And after graduation, when these students read their master's theses and graduated and they'd walked off the platform, down there waiting to greet them would be the deacons from these towns looking for pastors. And they would be holding up signs with numbers on them. 28, 31, 42. Those were the numbers of eligible females in the town. No, I'm just... Okay, it wasn't quite that bad, but there are accounts that sometimes it did in fact resort to that. Well, you couldn't just trust anybody to fill the shoes of Solomon Stoddard. Solomon Stoddard was called the Pope of the Connecticut River Valley. Such was his clout that as he got older, a highway was built for him so that he could go from Northampton straight across the state all the way back to Boston to his beloved Harvard to attend graduation days. That was the clout of Solomon Stoddard. 62 years minister of Northampton Church. Now, who possibly could replace him? It had to be his own blood, and it had to be somebody who had something to offer, potential. So they pegged Jonathan. So in 1727, he gets invited to be the assistant minister at Northampton Congregational Church. Now he has a respectable job. Now he's actually going to get an income. He may have to write his deacons to remind them that they owe him money, but he's going to get money. And so in 1727, Edward's life changes remarkably. He becomes the assistant minister at Northampton, and he marries. He marries Sarah Pierpont Edwards. Now we'll talk mostly about Edward's ministerial life, so we'll say a little bit about the home that Jonathan and Sarah had. First of all, we have to understand that one of the biographers of the Edwardses entitled the biography, Marriage to a Difficult Man. So that gives us some insight into what Sarah was dealing with. Some of that stems from Edward's statement, and I don't know if this was every day or not, but Edward's statement that he spent 12 hours a day in his study. Now, it may not have been 12 hours, but it was likely a big chunk of time. Edward was never very sociable. In fact, back when he was at Yale, in his diary, he goes home one time after attending some sort of occasion, event, party at Yale, and he says that he just spent the whole time sort of in the corner watching everybody, and he wishes he could participate and sort of let his hair down. I guess we always wear the wig, but he let his hair down with his, with the fellows. So Edwards was never the sociable type, and visitors to the home would say that once Edwards was finished his meal and had a sort of minor time of polite conversation, he would simply excuse himself, get up from the table, go to his study, close the door behind him, and once again be in his books. And Sarah would be left to entertain the guests and keep the children moving. So maybe Marriage to a Difficult Man isn't so bad a title after all. But what we also know is that Edwards, on his deathbed, and we'll revisit this at the end, writes of his uncommon union that he shares with Sarah. So this was a remarkable relationship. And again, as we'll see, not one that was just charmed. It too was touched by conflict, and we'll see that. They had 11 children. The first 4 were girls, and everybody thought the same thing was going to happen to them that happened to Timothy. But lo and behold, there were some boys. There was even Jonathan Edwards Jr., who himself goes on to be a college president and a writer as well, and make some significant contributions. Many of these daughters married pastors. The one we already mentioned, Esther Edwards Burr, married Aaron Burr, who was a pastor and also a president of Princeton. In fact, it's when he dies, leaving Esther a widow to take care of 2 young children, Sarah, or Sally, as she called her, and Aaron Burr Jr. It's when her husband dies, Aaron Burr Sr., that Edwards is called to be president of Princeton. When Edwards told his family that they were going to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and you can sort of picture it, by now he'd been kicked out of Northampton. That's sort of a spoiler alert. We haven't gotten to that yet, but once he gets kicked out of Northampton, it's not exactly sure what Edwards is going to do next. And when he eventually decides he's going to go to Stockbridge, you can imagine, they call the family in together and they say, "We're moving to Stockbridge. Yes, it's a wilderness. Yes, there's none of the comforts of Northampton. Yes, we'll probably be attacked by Indians sometime, but we're moving to Stockbridge." 3 of the daughters get married that summer. So we see what that's all about. One of the best letters I think that we have that shows some insight into the family life is Sarah was in Boston visiting her uncle. This was the aunt and uncle that she had spent time with when she was young and was sent to Boston for some significant time and to finishing school in Boston herself. And she had spent time with them and grown close with them. And so as they were getting older, she decided she would go and visit them in Boston. And as she was there, her aunt took a turn and was likely going to pass away any moment. And so Sarah decided to stay there and stay through. But of course, she didn't die for a while. And so Jonathan writes a letter to Sarah. And he says, Lucy woke up and is sick with the headache. The headache is what he said. And he starts naming all the ills. And then he says, when are you coming home? So you get the idea that Edwards really missed having Sarah, and that caring for this home of 11 children did in fact have its challenges from time to time. Well, in 1727, he marries Sarah. He's pastor of Northampton. And remember the deal. About 5 or 7 years away from the guy dying, you get in an assistant. The assistant learns the pastoral ministry on the job in an apprenticeship, begins to assume some of the pastoral responsibilities. As the minister gets older, he passes things off to the younger guy, and then eventually the younger guy takes over and the older pastor dies, and 5 to 7 years into this, the guy becomes pastor. Stoddard forgot about the 5 to 7 years part, and 2 years into this relationship, Stoddard dies. Edwards becomes the pastor of the second largest church in the colonies as a 26-year-old man in a culture and in an age when age mattered significantly. And this just wasn't the passing of anyone. This was the passing of the Pope of the Connecticut River Valley. Edwards has his work cut out for him as the minister of the Northampton Church. And we'll pick up the story again, 1729, in our next session together.